For 11 years, I worked as a wildlife biologist for the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources, operating out of the Marion Field Office in Smith County. Most of that work would bore you. I aged deer at check stations. I trapped and collared black bears. I sat through public meetings where retired men yelled at me about coyotes. I wrote reports that maybe 4 people ever read. It was a good job, and I was good at it. And for most of those 11 years, I believed that the woods in my district held nothing I couldn't identify, dart, tag, or explain. I want to be careful about how I tell this, because I know how it sounds. I've spent my whole career being the person on the other side of stories like this one. Somebody calls the office swearing they saw a mountain lion, and I'm the one who drives out, looks at the tracks, and tells them it was a bobcat and their fear did the rest. I've explained away black panthers, wolves, and one memorable werewolf that turned out to be a mangy coyote with a hairless tail. I know what people see in the woods at night, and I know what their minds do with it. So understand that everything I'm about to describe, I first tried to kill with every explanation I had. I ran it through 11 years of training. The explanations didn't survive. The thing did. This happened in the fall of 2022 in Scott County, Virginia, in a drainage off the Clinch River between Dungannon and Fort Blackmore. The locals call it Grassy Branch, after the creek that runs through the bottom of it. It's a steep, closed-in hollow, maybe 900 acres of hardwood and rhododendron running back from the river into the flank of the mountain, and almost all of it belongs to one landowner. There's a single gated logging road in, one old clearing about 2/3 of the way up where a homestead used to stand, and past that, nothing. No trails, no leases, nobody hunts it. That last part is what put it on my desk. Chronic wasting disease had been moving through Virginia's deer herd for years by then, and the department was expanding its surveillance zones. If you don't know what chronic wasting disease is, it's a prion disease. It eats holes in a deer's brain over the course of months. An infected deer loses weight, loses coordination, loses its fear of people, and dies, and there is no cure, and no vaccine and no live test that's practical at scale. The way we tracked it was through numbers. Harvest data, check station samples, roadkill collection, and camera surveys. Population counts, in and out, year over year. If the numbers in an area started behaving strangely, we looked closer. The numbers around Grassy Branch had been behaving strangely for a long time. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of thing only a person who stares at spreadsheets for a living would ever notice. The properties bordering that hollow produced normal harvest numbers, normal buck-to-doe ratios, normal everything, with one exception. Deer wearing ear tags or collars from our regional studies had a habit of dropping out of the data when their movement tracks crossed into that drainage. Not all of them. But over 15 years we'd had 6 collared deer go into Grassy Branch and stop transmitting, and 0 collared deer come out. Collars fail all the time. But 6 for 6 is not failure. 6 for 6 is a pattern. There was one more thing, and I only found it because I went digging through the old files. A district technician named Harold Slemp had run a camera survey on the edge of that property back in 2009. His summary sheet was 2 paragraphs long. The first paragraph said the survey was terminated early due to equipment problems. The second paragraph said, and I'm quoting it word for word because I've read it a few hundred times since, "Count data from this site could not be reconciled and should not be used. Recommend excluding this drainage from future survey rotation." Could not be reconciled. In 11 years of reading survey summaries, I had never seen anybody write that. Counts come out messy, sure. You write low confidence. You write estimate only. You don't write that the numbers cannot be reconciled, because that sentence doesn't mean the data is bad. It means the data is impossible. I should have called Harold right then. He was retired by that point, living over in Chilhowie. Instead, I did what I always did, which was assume the guy before me was sloppy, and put Grassy Branch on my survey list for October. The landowner was a woman named Ruth Compton. She was in her 80s, and she lived alone in a brick house near the mouth of the hollow. And when I called her about access, she didn't ask me a single question about the survey. Most landowners want to know everything. What the cameras see, whether we share pictures, whether this means the state is coming for their property. Ruth Compton asked me nothing. She said I could put up whatever I wanted, and then she said the only thing she ever really said to me, which was that the gate got locked at dark, and I'd want to be on the right side of it when it did. I took that as an old woman being particular about her gate. I signed her access form, took the spare key she kept in a coffee can on the porch, and drove up the logging road for the first time on the 4th of October. I want to describe the hollow honestly, without dressing it up, because in daylight there was nothing wrong with it. It was pretty. The road ran along grassy branch through big tulip poplars and white oaks, and the creek was clear, and the leaves were starting to turn. Squirrels everywhere. Good mast crop that year, acorns crunching under the tires. The old clearing at the top was about 4 acres of broom sedge and goldenrod with a collapsed chimney standing in the middle of it, and the deer sign around it was heavy. Trails pressed into the grass, fresh droppings, rubs on the cedars at the woodline. As deer habitat, it was excellent. Whatever instinct is supposed to warn you about a place, mine said nothing that first day. I've thought about that a lot since. Either the feeling people describe is a myth, or the hollow knew how to be quiet. I hung 8 cameras. 5 around the clearing covering the main trails, 2 on the creek crossings below it, and 1 high on the ridge saddle where the deer moved over into the next drainage. Standard grid, infrared flash, no visible light, batteries good for months, cards big enough to hold tens of thousands of images. I set them all to take 3 photo bursts with a 30-second delay, checked my angles, locked the gate behind me, and left. The whole visit took 4 hours, and it was the last normal day I ever spent in that place. I came back to pull the cards on the 25th of October. Card checks are usually the fun part of the job. It's Christmas morning for wildlife people. You never know what walked past. I sat in my truck at the bottom of the hollow with a card reader and a laptop and started with the clearing cameras. And for the first 20 minutes, everything was exactly what it should have been. Fawns feeding in the broom sedge. A decent 8-point buck working a scrape. Turkeys. A bear that had smelled the camera and given it a long, offended look. Thousands of images, and all of them ordinary. The count problem showed up when I started doing the actual work. The main group using that clearing was a doe herd, 14 animals. I got to know them well over the following weeks, but even on that first card pull, they were easy to track as a unit because of a mature doe with a torn left ear who always led them in. They fed through the clearing most evenings. The camera coverage was good enough that I could watch the whole group enter from the north wood line, feed across, and exit south toward the creek. And because I'm the kind of person who counts things, I counted them. In and out, every pass. 14 deer walked into that clearing. 13 walked out. The first time I saw it, I assumed I'd missed an animal in the frame edges, or one had doubled back out of coverage. That's normal. Deer aren't marching bands. But it kept happening, not every night. Every 3rd or 4th night, the group entered with 14 and left with 13, and then, a few nights later, they'd enter with 14 again. The herd size never actually dropped. No matter how many times the count came up 1 short on the way out, the next entry was 14. I want you to sit with how wrong that is, because I don't think it lands unless you've done this work. If a herd loses an animal, the herd is smaller. If a predator takes one, you find sign. A kill site, drag marks, scavengers. I walked that clearing and the woods around it on my next visit, and I walked it hard, a full grid search over 2 days, and I found nothing. No carcasses, no bones, no hairbeds where coyotes had worked something over. Stranger than that, no vultures, and there are always vultures in Scott County in October. In 2 days of searching, I never saw a single one over that hollow. I noted it in my field book on the 27th of October, and I remember exactly what I wrote, because it was the first sentence I ever wrote about Grassy Branch that scared me a little to put on paper. I wrote, "No scavenger activity observed in drainage, none. Deer don't disappear without feeding something. Everything in the woods gets eaten. That's the whole arrangement. Unless the thing that took them wasn't leaving anything behind, or wasn't taking them to eat at all. I told myself it was a counting artifact. I told myself a doe was slipping out through a coverage gap. I moved 2 cameras to close the gaps. And while I was in the images fixing my counts, I found the second problem. And the second problem was worse. I found it because of the burn-in. When you review thousands of photos from a fixed camera, the background becomes wallpaper. Same trees, same chimney, same slope of grass, frame after frame, until your eyes stop seeing it at all. You're looking at the deer in the foreground, because the deer are what changes. It took me somewhere north of 4,000 images before my eye finally snagged on the thing in the background that never changed. And once I saw it, I couldn't understand how I'd missed it, and I've never fully trusted my own eyes since. At the far north end of the clearing, at the absolute limit of the infrared flash, right at the ragged edge where the image grain dissolves into the dark, there was a deer standing at the wood line. Head up, body facing the camera, every night. It was in the background of the herd photos. It was in the background of the buck photos. It was there behind the turkeys, and there behind the bear. Not in every frame, but in every night, somewhere, at that same distance, at the edge of at least one camera's reach. Always standing in the open just enough to register, always facing the lens. That alone wouldn't have meant much. Deer stare at cameras. The infrared isn't as invisible as the manufacturers claim, and a sharp-eyed doe will pick up the glow of the sensor and lock onto it. I've got thousands of photos of deer staring straight down the barrel. But those deer stare and then they go back to feeding. Because a deer is a stomach with legs, and October is the eating season, and no wild animal spends its night doing nothing. So I did what I do, I quantified it. I went back through every card and pulled every frame that had the background deer in it, and I put them in their own folder, and when I was done, that folder had 611 images spanning 20 nights. And in 611 images, that animal never once had its head down, never fed, never browsed a twig, never turned broadside, never bedded, never did one single thing a deer does. It stood at maximum distance, with its head up, and its body oriented on the camera. And the only thing that ever changed between frames was that sometimes it was 3 or 4 steps farther left or right, repositioned, the way you'd move to keep an angle on something. I measured it too, because measuring is how I stay calm. There was a cluster of saplings at the north wood line that showed in the frames, and I'd walked past them, so I knew their height. Scaling off those saplings, the animal stood about 41 inches at the shoulder. That's big for a doe in southwest Virginia. That's the top of the range, and it was the same 41 inches in every camera it appeared in, which told me it was one animal, one individual, holding the far edge of my survey grid every single night for 3 weeks, watching the cameras watch the deer. I remember closing the laptop in the truck and sitting there with my thumb on the card reader, and the thought I had was not a frightened thought. It was worse than that. It was the flat professional thought I'd have about any animal. And it just came up on its own, the way training does. The thought was, that's not vigilance, vigilance scans. That's surveillance, surveillance holds. And then underneath it, quieter, it knows where every camera is. I drove back up on the 2nd of November to move cameras and do the grid search I mentioned, the one that found nothing dead. That was also the visit where the holo stopped pretending in small ways. The first thing was camera 4. Camera 4 sat on a white oak covering the main creek crossing, strapped at chest height, and when I walked up on it, it was facing the tree, not knocked sideways. Facing the trunk, lens an inch from the bark, and the strap was still buckled. Bears mess with cameras constantly. A bear will chew a camera, claw it, rip it off the tree, and carry it 40 yards to die in a laurel thicket. I've recovered cameras with canine punctures clean through the housing. What a bear does not do is unbuckle a nylon strap, rotate the camera housing around the tree, and buckle the strap back. And that strap was rebuckled. I know because I buckle my straps on the third hole, every camera, every time, out of pure habit, and this one was buckled on the fourth. Somebody, and I was still saying somebody at that point, had taken it off, turned it to face the bark, and put it back on, one hole loose. The card told me when. The last real image on camera 4 was time-stamped 11 minutes after I'd locked the gate on my previous visit. 11 minutes after I left the holo, something walked to that camera. The final frames were the 3-shot burst it fired, as whatever it was came in close. And I want to describe those frames carefully, because they're the reason I stopped sleeping well that fall. The first frame of the burst showed the crossing, empty, and at the top edge of the image, at the far side of the creek, 4 legs, just legs, entering the frame, the body above them cut off by the top of the image. The legs were wrong. I've looked at more deer legs than any person should. A deer's hind leg has a hock that points backward, and people who don't know anatomy sometimes think deer knees bend the wrong way, and they're mistaken. It's an ankle. It's all normal. I've explained it at 100 check stations. I could not make these legs normal. The joints sat too high, and the front legs bent where deer legs don't have a joint at all. A soft flex in the middle of the cannon bone. In the straight part, the part that is one solid bone and cannot bend. In a still photo, not a trick of motion blur. The leg was at rest, planted in the creek gravel, bent in the middle of the bone. The second frame was corrupted. Gray digital smear across most of the image, the kind of artifacting you get from a failing card, except this card tested fine before and after, and the only corrupted frames it ever produced were the ones with that thing close to the lens. Through the smear, you could see a shape filling the frame, pale, and one dark round spot near the top that I have decided was not an eye, because deciding otherwise doesn't help me. The third frame was bark. Camera 4 spent the next 19 days photographing the tree it was strapped to, firing on schedule every time a squirrel moved, and I scrolled through 19 days of oak bark knowing that the whole time, my survey had a hole in it exactly where the creek crossing was, and that the hole had been put there on purpose 11 minutes after I left. I say I was still saying somebody. Here is why that comfort didn't survive the afternoon. It rained hard on the 30th of October, and the creek bank below camera 4 was soft, clean mud, and it held everything that had crossed since the rain. I found my own boot prints going in. I found raccoon, bobcat, 1 bear, and deer, lots of deer, and crossing the softest stretch of that bank, walking a straight line to the camera tree and away from it, I found deer tracks that measured almost 5 inches long, spread wide at the toe, pressed deep, in a walking pattern where the tracks fell in single file, one print directly in front of the other, a tightrope line. Deer don't walk like that. Deer have a wide chest, and their left and right tracks land on the left and the right. A big buck's trail might narrow, but it never becomes a single line. Foxes walk a near-perfect line. Cats do. Things that stalk do. What I had was a line of deer prints laid down the way a predator walks, straight to my camera, and straight back, and no human boot print anywhere near it. I stood on that creek bank, and I did the thing you do, which is look up and check the wood line, and the woods gave me nothing back. And for the first time in my career, I felt watched in a way I couldn't argue myself out of, because for once, I had the data. 611 photographs of the watcher. I pulled camera 4 entirely, reset the others, and I was at the gate with it locked behind me a full hour before dark, and I sat in my truck on the county road for a minute with my hands on the wheel. And then I drove to Chilhowie and knocked on Harold Slemp's door. Harold was in his 70s, and when I told him where I'd been running cameras, he didn't say anything for a while. He didn't ask what I'd found. That was the tell, the same as Ruth Compton never asking. People who don't know that hollow ask questions. People who know it don't want the answers repeated in their kitchen. I laid it out anyway. The counts. 14 in, 13 out, 14 in again. The background animal. The camera turned to the tree. He listened to all of it looking at the table, and when I finished, he told me 2 things, and they're the only dialogue from this whole account that I'll quote, because they're the only words that mattered. He said, "The count's not wrong. You're counting 14 going in because 14 go in. There's 13 deer in that group." And when I asked him what he meant, he was quiet for a long time. And then he said, "Pull your cameras in daylight. Don't sit that hollow after dark. It lets the cameras alone mostly, because cameras leave. You sit there in the dark, you're something new, and it comes to look at new things." 13 deer in a 14 deer group. I drove home, and I opened the folder, and I did the thing that I would give a fair amount of my remaining years to be able to undo, because you can't unknow a thing like this. I went through the entry photos, the 14 coming in, frame by frame, and I stopped looking at the herd and started looking at each animal. And once you look at them as individuals, you can see it. Every entry, 14 animals. 13 of them feeding, flicking ears, swatting tails, being deer. And one at the back, always at the back, head up, never feeding, holding position at the rear of the group at a fixed distance, the same 41 inches at the shoulder, walking its tracks into the tracks of the deer ahead of it. It wasn't taking one of them. Those nights the count came out 13. It was staying behind. The herd walked out, and it stayed in the dark clearing with my cameras. And the reason I had 611 photos of it standing at the North Wood Line is that the North Wood Line is where it went to stand once it was alone. The herd knew. That was the part I couldn't get past as a biologist, and it's the detail I'd ask you to remember out of everything here. In every frame, the real deer never looked at it. Not once. 6 weeks of imagery, thousands of photos, an animal walking among them close enough to touch, and not one doe ever turned her head toward it, ever flagged, ever blew an alarm. Deer stare at everything. Deer stare at falling leaves. The only thing in those woods they refused to look at was the thing walking at the back of their own group, and prey animals only act that way around something they cannot afford to acknowledge. They weren't fooled. They were behaving. It moved with them because they didn't dare do anything about it, and it fed on something out there, on some schedule, because every few weeks, quietly, the torn ear doe's group had a new young doe in it that I didn't recognize, and I stopped trying to figure out where the previous ones went. There's one more thing that happened before the night in the blind, and it matters, because it's the only time I ever saw it in daylight, and daylight is supposed to be where explanations live. On the 7th of November, I went up at noon to swap batteries and reposition 2 cameras. Bright, cold, cloudless day. Frost gone off the grass by the time I reached the clearing. I'd made myself a rule after the creek bank, which was that I moved fast. I kept the truck close, and I kept my head up, and I was following the rule. Standing at camera 2 on the east edge of the clearing with the housing open in my hands, when I got the feeling of a presence that everyone who works outdoors knows, the ordinary one, the one that usually turns out to be a squirrel judging you. I looked up across the clearing, and at the far side, standing in the broom sedge about 80 yards out in full sun, there was a deer. Nothing about the first glance was wrong. That's the thing I need you to understand about this animal, and I think it's the reason the whole region has stories about it. The first glance is fine. Your eye takes in deer shape, deer color, deer size, and files it, and moves on. And it's the second glance that ruins you, because the second glance is when the details start arriving in the wrong order. It was facing me straight on, and it was too still. Deer are never still. Even a deer locked onto danger is a system of small motions, ears swiveling independently, tail twitching, skin shivering off flies, nostrils working. This one stood the way furniture stands. The ears never moved once. In the cold, I could see my own breath, and the herd animals I'd watched that fall all steamed at the muzzle, and across 80 yards of clean November air. This one produced nothing. No breath. I stood there holding a camera housing and doing arithmetic about that. I had my binoculars around my neck, 10 power. I raised them slowly, and I found it, and the glass did what glass does, which is take away the distance that was letting me stay calm. The coat was almost right. That's the best I can say about it. The color sat correctly along the back and went wrong at the edges, at the brisket and the legs, where it thinned out in a way that suggested the coat was a surface rather than a pelt. And I'm aware that sentence doesn't fully make sense, and I've never found a better one. The face is what I remember. A deer's eyes sit on the sides of its skull, because a deer is prey, and prey buys vision in a circle so nothing can come from behind. It's one of the first things you learn, and one of the last things you'd ever think to check, because it's never once been worth checking. Both of its eyes were on the front of its face, set forward, under the brow, spaced the way a predator's eyes are spaced, the way a wolf's are, the way mine are, and both of them were pointed at me with the specific weighted attention that only forward eyes can produce. Side-eyed animals watch you as one input among many. This thing regarded me. There was assessment in it. There was patience in it. and there was something in it that I have only ever seen in one other kind of face, and I'm not going to name the kind, because you already know, and hearing it out loud doesn't help either of us. We stood like that for what my watch later suggested was over 4 minutes. I know I never heard a bird in that time, and the clearing had been full of them when I walked in. I made a decision that I still think was the right one, which was to finish my job. Slowly, with the binoculars back on my chest, I closed the camera housing, buckled the strap on the third hole, and walked, not fast, along the edge of the clearing toward the truck, keeping it at the corner of my vision the whole way, and it stood there and rotated its head to track me. Only the head, the body never shifting its feet, the neck carrying the head around further than it should have gone. And I got in the truck and I looked back through the windshield at the far side of the clearing. 80 yards of open sunlit broom sedge, and it was gone. No motion had crossed the open ground. The wood line was a full 30 yards behind where it had stood. I had looked away for the length of time it takes a man to climb into a pickup. 3 seconds, maybe 4. And in my 4 seconds it had covered 30 yards of dry, frosted grass to the trees without a sound reaching me. Or it had done something else. And I've chosen to believe it went to the trees, because the grass in that clearing stood 2 feet high at most, and there was nothing else out there to be behind. I sat in the truck with the engine running and wrote the encounter into my field book with a shaking hand. Time, distance, duration, description, because data is the only prayer I know. Then I drove down, and at the bottom of the hollow I stopped at the gate, and I remember looking at Ruth Compton's brick house through the bare trees, and understanding, in a settled, bone-level way, why every window on the back of that house, the side facing the hollow, had its curtains drawn in the middle of a sunny afternoon. 2 days later, at a check station over in Nicholsville, I aged a buck for a man who'd killed it on the ridge adjoining the Compton land, the far side, outside the hollow. While I worked, he talked, the way hunters do, and without any prompting from me, he said he'd nearly come off that ridge at a run on opening morning, because at first light, a deer had walked out below his stand, and it had stopped, and it had looked up at him, and he'd had deer look at him his whole life, and this was not that, and he'd let it walk, and he'd hunted somewhere else ever since. He laughed when he told it, the way men laugh when they want a thing to be smaller than it was. I didn't laugh, and he noticed I didn't, and he stopped talking, and we finished up with the jawbone in silence. 2 men declining to compare notes, because comparing notes makes a thing official. I'm going to be honest about the next decision, because it was mine, and I own it. Harold told me not to sit the hollow at night, and 8 days later, I sat the hollow at night. I could dress it up as protocol, and there was protocol. The survey design did call for 1 direct observation count, thermal optics, dusk through dawn, to true up the camera data. But I could have skipped it. I wrote the design. The truth is that I had spent 11 years being the man with the explanation, and I could not stand being the man with the folder of photographs instead, and I believed, in the way that has gotten better field people than me killed, that understanding a thing protects you from it. On the 11th of November, I told Ruth Compton I'd be staying the night up at the clearing for a count. She looked at me the way you'd look at weather coming, and she didn't argue, and she didn't lock the gate that night. And I understand now that leaving it open was the kindest thing anyone did for me that whole fall. I set a pop-up ground blind on the south edge of the clearing, tucked back into the cedars, scent control, no light, thermal monocular, notebook, and one thing I'd never once brought on a deer survey in my life, which was my sidearm. I told myself it was for coyotes. Writing that sentence down at the time embarrassed me. It doesn't anymore. The evening was normal for exactly 2 hours and 40 minutes. Deer filtered in around 5. I picked up the torn-ear doe and her group through the thermal, glowing white against the cold ground, and I ran my counts, and the count was 13, and I sat in the dark with that number and felt something in my chest unclench a little. 13 deer, feeding, normal. Maybe the 14th thing had rules. Maybe it didn't come every night. At 9:40, all 13 deer stopped feeding at the same time, not staggered, not one head up, then another. All 13 heads rose in the same second, the way birds turn in a flock, and they held still for maybe half a minute, and then they walked out of that clearing to the south in a fast single line, right past my blind, close enough that I heard their steps in the frost, and there was no snort, no alarm, no flag. Deer that spook make noise about it. These left the way people leave a room when the wrong man walks in. Quiet, immediate, and all at once. And then the clearing was empty, and I did the slow thermal sweep, south to north. And at the north wood line, 40 yards out, standing in the open, there was a shape with the body of a deer, and the body read gray. Cold gray, ground temperature gray. The gray of rocks and logs and dead things, everywhere except the head. The head was white hot, brighter than the deer had been. Brighter than any living reading I've ever taken off an animal. A burning white head sitting on top of a cold body. And the head was pointed at my blind. I did not move for 6 hours. I want that to sound harder than it does. 6 hours, mid-November. No heater, no light. Holding a monocular to my eye until the eye ached and switching eyes and holding it again. Because the alternative was not knowing where it was. And every time I lowered the optic to rest and raised it again, the shape was a little closer. I never saw it take a step. Understand me. I watched that thing more continuously than I have ever watched anything. And it never moved while I was looking, not once. And it was 40 yards away at 9:40, and it was inside 25 yards by 2 in the morning. The gaps were my blinks, my eye changes, the 4 seconds here and there when a man's arms simply give out. It moved inside my 4 seconds. It had all night, and it spent my 4-second gaps closing 15 yards. And I believe it did it that way because it understood exactly what I could see and when, the same way it had understood the cameras all along. Around 3 in the morning, the head tilted. I'll describe it once. The neck turned the head sideways, and the tilt kept going, past the shoulder, past 90 degrees, to an angle where the skull was near upside down. Ears pointing at the frost, and it held that, and the whole time the hot white of the head stayed fixed on my blind. And I understood I was being examined by something that was doing to me exactly what I had been doing to it for 6 weeks, holding the far edge, watching the new thing, taking its count. It never came closer than 25 yards. At the first gray light, when the trees started to have edges again, it turned, and I saw it walk in plain view for the only time, and the gait is the thing I can't file anywhere. Every part of the walk happened in the right order, and each step landed a half beat off the rhythm, joints catching and releasing, the front legs flexing in that mid-bone place where there is no joint. And at the wood line it stopped, and its head came around over its spine, all the way around, to point back at me while its body faced the woods, and it held that for 3 or 4 seconds. Then it walked into the trees, and the sun came up, and I sat in that blind until it was full, hard daylight before I trusted my legs. I pulled all 8 cameras that same morning. Every one, straps and all, working fast with my truck backed up the logging road and the driver door standing open. The last camera I pulled was camera 7, which I'd repositioned on my previous visit without telling anyone, including my own field notes. I'd aimed it at the spot where I planned to put my blind. I'd covered my own position, 11 years of habit, and it's the only reason I know the rest. I reviewed that card in my kitchen with the doors locked. Camera 7 had fired all night. It caught me walking in at 4 in the afternoon. It caught the herd pass at 9:40, and at 10 minutes past 6 in the evening, more than 3 hours before the deer ever lifted their heads, more than 3 hours before I found it in the thermal at the north wood line, it caught the shape entering the frame from the south, from behind my blind, and standing still at the edge of the cedars, 11 yards from where I sat facing the blind. It stood there in frame after frame, timestamp after timestamp, 6:10, 6:40, 7:15, 8 o'clock, while I sat 11 yards away running my counts and feeling relieved. It had been behind me the whole evening. The thing I found at the north wood line at 9:40 had not arrived there. It had walked a slow half circle around me to the far side, and let the herd out, and then let me find it, at a distance, in the open, because that was where it wanted my attention. I had 6 hours of watching it across a clearing while congratulating myself on never losing it, and the camera says my watch started 3.5 hours after its watch did. The final frames on camera 7, the burst fired closest to the blind, are corrupted. Gray smear, one pale shape. I deleted them, and I'm not sorry, and I delete them again. Here is how it ended, and why you've never read about any of this in a state publication. My official survey report for that drainage, filed the 3rd week of November 2022, says the following. Camera equipment at this site experienced repeated data corruption and one physical disturbance consistent with bear activity. Count data could not be validated. Direct observation was attempted and terminated due to equipment failure. Recommend excluding this drainage from the survey rotation. Could not be reconciled. Recommend excluding. I wrote Harold Slimp's report 13 years after he did, almost word for word, and I finally understood that his 2 paragraphs were never sloppiness. They were a locked gate. Because I sat in my office and thought about what an honest report would set in motion. Follow-up surveys. A graduate student alone hanging cameras. Technicians doing night counts because the data was interesting. Some 24-year-old sitting in a blind in that clearing because a spreadsheet sent them there, the way a spreadsheet sent me. The department runs on curiosity. Everything I could truthfully write was bait. So I falsified a federal adjacent wildlife document, and I would do it again without losing a minute of sleep, because I lose my sleep over other things now. I drove out to return Ruth Compton's gate key the week after I filed it. She took the key, and she asked me nothing, and I told her nothing, and we stood on her porch for a second in that silence, and she nodded at me once, the way you nod at a man who has finally read the sign everybody else read years ago. Her family had held that hollow for over a century, and posted it, and locked it, and let the timber money and the lease money go. Generation after generation, and I used to think land like that was wasted. Now I think the Comptons have been performing a public service since before I was born, and the price of it is that they can never tell anyone what the service is. The Tournier Does group is still up there, I'd guess. 13 deer, the count is 13. It was always 13. I stayed with the department another 2 years, and I never put a camera within 5 miles of that drainage again, and nobody else has either, because the file says there's nothing there worth counting. I do private consulting now, deer density surveys for landowners and hunt clubs, and I'm told I'm thorough. I am. Every survey I run, I count the herd twice. The first count is for the client, and it's the number of animals in the frame. The second count is for me. The second count is how many of them are feeding, how many of them are moving the way weight and bone have to move, how many of them the other deer are willing to look at. The second count is how many of them are deer. So far, the 2 numbers have always matched. On the day they don't, I already know exactly what I'll do, because I've done it before. I'll close the laptop, and I'll write that the data could not be reconciled, and I'll recommend that nobody ever look again. The job posting said 6 weeks, backcountry, solo, and it paid $19 an hour plus a per diem I'd never be anywhere to spend. Trail maintenance in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, Hazel Creek Drainage, North Carolina side. Clear the winter blowdowns, brush back the corridor, rebuild water bars, report bridge conditions. Housing provided, and the housing was a tent. I was 43 that spring and between lives. I'd cut trees for a living since I was 20, first on wildland fire crews out west, then 15 years as a line clearance arborist around Morganton until the company sold and the new outfit brought their own crews up from Georgia. I had a paid-off truck, a storage unit, and no particular place to be. A man I'd fought fire with told me the park hired sawyers every spring and never had enough of them. I applied on a Tuesday. They called me Thursday morning, which should have told me something. Government jobs don't call back in 2 days unless nobody else wants the job. The orientation was at park headquarters at Sugarlands, outside Gatlinburg, first week of May, 2023. A trail supervisor named Kathy walked me through the radio protocols and the bear protocols and the paperwork. She was friendly and fast, and she had done this speech a lot. Near the end, she slid a map across the table with my section marked in yellow highlighter. Hazel Creek Trail, from the lakeshore up to Bone Valley, plus the Bone Valley Spur, 14 miles of trail, give or take, in the most remote drainage in the park. I asked her the normal question, who had it last season? She looked at the map instead of at me, and said they rotated people through that section, that nobody did it twice. and that it was a scheduling thing. Then she gave me the rest of the packet and wished me luck. And that was the whole conversation. I have replayed it a few times since. She never lied to me. Rotating people through because nobody will go back is still a rotation. You can't drive to Hazel Creek. That's the first thing to understand about the place. When they built Fontana Dam during the war, the lake drowned the road, and it drowned the bottomland towns with it. Proctor, Judson, Bushnell. Hundreds of families got bought out or forced out, and the government promised to build a road back around the north shore of the lake so people could visit their family cemeteries, and the government never built it. 70 years of never built it. The families that stayed bitter about it had a point. The only way in now is by boat across Fontana, or by walking 20-some miles over the ridges with everything on your back. A man named Denny ran the shuttle out of Fontana Marina, a flat gray John boat with a 50-horse motor and a milk crate for a passenger seat. He hauled me and 11 days of food and a chainsaw and a crosscut and my tools across the lake on the morning of the 8th of May. Flat water, fog coming off it, the mountains standing straight up out of the far shore with no houses on them, and no roads on them and no lights on them at all. Denny didn't talk much, which suited me. When he swung the boat into the mouth of Hazel Creek and cut the motor to drift me into the bank, he looked up the drainage for a second, at the fog sitting in it, and he said the only thing he said that whole ride. He said, "I'm here Tuesdays and Fridays if somebody flags me from the bank. You won't see me otherwise." Then he set my gear on the mud and backed the boat off and was gone, and the sound of the motor went away down the lake, and it got quiet in a way I hadn't heard in years. Not silent. Quiet. Water moving. A grouse drumming somewhere upslope, wind way up high in the tops. Good sounds. I stood there on the bank of Hazel Creek with a summer's worth of work in front of me, and I remember thinking I'd landed the best job of my life. For the first week, I was right. I set my base camp at Campsite 86 at Proctor, about a half-mile up from the lake. There's a white house standing there in the woods, the old Calhoun house. The last building left from when Proctor was a lumber town of 1,000 people. There's a horse barn the park keeps up, and there are chimneys and foundations back in the trees. And up on the hill there's a cemetery, with fresh plastic flowers on some of the graves. The park runs a ferry once a year for the families, on Decoration Day, and they come across and mow the graves of their people, and put out new flowers and leave. The rest of the year, nobody. I want that fact in your pocket for later. Once a year. The work was the work. I'd saw out the blowdowns from the winter, buck them into rounds, roll them off the trail, cut the brush back an arm's length on both sides, clean the water bars so the spring rains wouldn't eat the treadway. I did it 8 or 9 hours a day, and I did it well, because it's what I know how to do, and a man alone in the woods needs his days to have a shape. Up at first light, coffee, walk to the day's stretch of trail, work until the light went yellow, walk back, cook, hang the food bag on the bear cables, sit by the fire an hour, sleep hard. The trail told me things while I worked, the way trails do. Boot prints from the last backpackers, days old, washing out. Bear sign, hog rooting, tore up ground where the wild hogs had been at the tubers. Turkey scratch. By the third day, I knew everything that was using that corridor, because reading ground is half of what an arborist does, and all of what a fire scout does, and there was nothing on that ground that didn't belong. The first wrong thing was small, and I explained it away, and that's how these things go. You spend the small wrong things the way you spend pocket change, and you don't miss them until you need them all at once. On the morning of the 13th of May, my second Saturday, I walked out to the stretch I'd been cutting, about 2 miles up from Proctor, and my plastic felling wedges were sitting on top of a stump beside the trail, stacked, 3 of them, squared up in a neat little tower on the flat of the stump. I carry 5 wedges. I'd had 5 in my kit bag the night before, in camp, in the vestibule of my tent. I stood there and looked at the 3 on the stump, and then I went through the kit bag and counted, and I had 2 in the bag, and 3 on a stump 2 miles from camp, stacked where I could not miss them. I ran it every way a reasonable man runs a thing. I'd left them. I'd set them there Friday evening and forgotten. Except I hadn't worked that stump Friday. I'd worked past it Thursday. And I don't leave wedges anywhere, ever, because wedges are the difference between a saw that works and a saw that's pinched in a log 12 miles from a road. It's a habit that lives below my thinking. the same as buckling my chaps. Somebody had come into my camp in the night, opened a kit bag 8 feet from my head, taken 3 wedges, and not the fuel, and not the food, and not the $400 saw, walked them 2 miles up the trail in the dark, and stacked them on a stump for me to find. I told myself it was another hiker with a strange sense of humor. There were no other hikers. I hadn't seen a boot print newer than 4 days in either direction, and I'd have known. I told myself it was me, tired, misremembering. I was neither. But there's no third thing to tell yourself on day 6 of 42. So I put the wedges in the bag, and I went to work, and I saw it all day with the feeling of the woods being slightly different behind me than in front of me. The second thing was the snare. I found it on the 17th, off the Bone Valley Spur, 10 feet up a game trail that crossed the human trail at a low gap. A snare loop, set for hog or deer, anchored to a bent-over hickory sapling. Poachers run snares in the park, it happens. The rangers deal with it. That's not what stopped me. What stopped me was the material and the make. The wire was modern galvanized electric fence wire, bright, new off a spool. And the knots were nothing. I mean, they were nothing I knew, and I have rigged rope and cable my whole working life. The wire was finished off in a lashing that went around and through itself in a pattern I couldn't follow with my eyes, tight even, done by hands that had made that lashing 10,000 times. It wasn't a poacher's twist and crimp, it was a craft. Somebody's grandfather had taught them that lashing, and his grandfather had taught him. New wire, old hands. I cut the snare out, coiled the wire, packed it out, and wrote it up for the rangers in my notebook. And that night at the fire, I caught myself sitting with my back against the horse barn wall instead of out in the open, and I hadn't decided to do that. My body had decided it. The deer was the 18th of May. 1 day later. I heard it happen, is the thing, or heard something. Deep in the night, up the slope east of camp, there was a single crash of brush, 1 animal's worth, and then nothing. No coyotes after it, no struggle. 1 crash, and the woods went back to the creek sound, and I lay in the tent listening for a long time, and then I slept, because a crash in the brush is nothing. A crash in the brush is every night in the woods. In the morning, 40 yards up that slope, laid out on the leaves where I would cross it on my shortcut to the trail, there was a deer. A young buck, dead, opened up and dressed out, gutted clean, hide gone, back straps and hindquarters gone, head left. And it was the cleanest field dressing I've ever seen, and I've dressed 100 deer, and there was not 1 knife mark on that animal. I got down on my knees in the leaves and looked. Where a blade slips and scores the inside of the ribs, nothing. Where you nick the hide starting your cut, no hide to check, but the membrane along the openings wasn't cut at all. It was parted, pressed apart and torn along lines the way you'd tear a chicken apart with your thumbs, if your thumbs were strong enough, and you'd done it your whole life. There were no drag marks coming in or going out. There was almost no blood on the leaves for what had been done to it. And it had been done in the dark, in silence, 40 yards from where I slept, in the hour after the 1 crash of brush, and then it had been left square across my morning route. Hunters hide their kills from rangers. Poachers pack out fast and leave the guts far from trails. Nobody dresses a deer bare-handed in the dark next to a stranger's camp and displays it. It wasn't a threat. I understood that even then, kneeling next to it with the hair standing up on my arms. A threat would have been the deer on my tent. This was set where I'd find it in good light. Whole story readable, nothing wasted, nothing sloppy. It was closer to a demonstration. Here is what we take. Here is how quietly. Here is how near to you. I got on the radio that evening from the high spot behind the cemetery, the only place in the lower drainage with line of sight to the repeater, and I gave dispatch my scheduled check-in, and I reported the snare, and I started to report the deer, and I heard how it was going to sound before I said it. A dressed-out deer with no knife marks. Sir, how do you know there were no knife marks? Because I knelt in the leaves and looked, ma'am. I gave them the snare and the wedge business and let the deer be possible poaching activity, will monitor, and dispatch copied it with no interest at all, and told me a ranger patrol would get up Hazel Creek when staffing allowed. And I signed off and stood up there by the graves in the last light with the plastic flowers going gray around me. And that was the first evening I heard the clicking. It came from across the creek, west side, in the laurel. Rhythmic, not woodpecker rhythm, they drum in rolls. This had spacing. It had intention in the spacing, the way a man tapping a table has intention. I stood dead still and listened, and it stopped, and I let out the breath I was holding, and then it answered itself from the east side of the drainage, behind me, upslope. Same pattern, talk, 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 two of them. Talking across the valley, over my head, about the thing standing between them in the graveyard. I walked down off that hill in the dusk at a pace just under a run, and I built the fire bigger than I needed it, and I sat with the axe leaned against my leg until past midnight. The clicking never came closer that night. It didn't need to. It had told me what it was for. It was a count. They were counting me, the way I counted deer sign on the trail, and the count came back the same every time. 1. Here is where I should have quit, and I want to be straight about why I didn't. It wasn't courage. Part of it was money. 6 weeks of that pay was the bridge between my old life and whatever came next. And a man who walks off a federal contract in week 2 doesn't get called for week 1 of anything else. Part of it was pride, the stupid kind, the kind that has buried better men than me. And part of it, the part that shames me now, was that I'd decided I understood the situation. Somebody lived back in there. Fine. People had lived in that drainage for 200 years before the government took it, and maybe not every family had come out when the lake went in, and whoever their grandchildren were, they were making a point about whose valley it was. I could respect the point. I'd keep to the trail, work my section, mind my business, and we'd share the woods for 5 more weeks. I built a whole treaty in my head. The other side never signed it. The rest of May they studied me, and I pretended I wasn't being studied. The clicking came most nights, always at the same time. That's the detail that took me too long to add up. Not the same clock time, the same moment in my routine. I'd cook, eat, wash the pot in the creek, hang the food bag, and sit down by the fire. And inside a minute of me sitting down, talk, 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 from one slope or the other. I sat down at different times on different nights. Didn't matter. The clicking was cued to me, to my body settling, which meant that every single evening, before I ever heard a thing, somebody was already in position on the slope, watching me eat. I tested it once, banked the fire, zipped into the tent loud, then lay there in my boots for 2 hours and eased back out with no light. I stood in the black by the cold fire ring and heard, 40 or 50 yards out in the dark, one careful footstep. Then nothing more for as long as I could stand to stand there. Whoever it was could wait longer than I could. That was true every night and both of us knew it. Food went missing in weights too small to swear to. A handful of rice, 2 tortillas out of a pack of 10. The bare cables hold a bag 20 feet up and 10 feet out, and nothing on 4 legs was getting at it, and the knots I tie off with were retied, not cut, retied, in that same over and through lashing from the snare. They could have taken it all. They took a tax. The tracks came after the rain, the night of the 26th of May. It rained hard from supper time to past midnight, a real mountain soaker, and a rain that hard wipes every mark off the ground. Every print on that trail the next morning was new since midnight, which is why I can tell you what I'm about to tell you with no hedging at all. I'd rebuilt a run of water bars that week on the grade above the forks, and I'd raked the treadway out smooth between them, 40 yards of clean dirt, and when I walked up onto that stretch in the morning, the clean dirt had traffic on it, bare feet, human bare feet, and I got down on my heels in the trail the way I'd knelt by the deer, and I stayed down there a long time. 2 adults and a small one. The adult prints ran better than 11 inches heel to toe, and they were wide in a way you don't see anymore. The toes splayed full out, each toe printing separate and strong, the whole forefoot pressed broad. Shoes make a foot. A foot that never wore them makes itself, and these feet had never worn them. No arch to speak of. Heavy callus, you could read it in the flat even pressure at the edges where a soft foot shows light. They'd come down the mountain in the dark, in the rain or right behind it. walking my raked trail single file the way they walked everything. And the small prince, a child's, 7 or 8 years old by the size, ran sometimes in file with the others, and sometimes straight out to the trail edge and back, the way a kid drifts and gets called in. There was a spot where the child's prince stopped and turned and stood, both feet planted, toes pointed downhill toward Proctor, toward my camp. Somebody small had stopped in the dark on my clean trail and looked down the mountain at where I slept, and then the big prince came back for it, and they went on. They were using my work. That was the part that sat me down on a rock, with the rain still dripping out of the trees. A month of my labor, every blowdown bucked, every stretch brushed out, and the first clean night after a rain showed me who I'd been working for. They moved on my trail because I'd made it quiet to move on. I'd been improving the roads of their country since the 8th of May, and they had watched me do it the way you'd watch a man paint your fence. And the wedges and the rice and the tally at the fire were how they'd talked about me among themselves the whole time. Not a threat. Livestock management. I was something that had wandered in, and I was useful, and I was fed, and I was watched, and the question they were still turning over, click by click across the valley every night, was what I was for when the work ran out. The backpackers came through 2 days later, the 28th, the only human beings I saw in 33 days. A young couple out of Knoxville, doing a loop over from Eagle Creek, good gear, sunburned, happy. They stopped where I was cutting, and we talked the way you talk in the backcountry, water levels and bear activity, and where they'd camped. They'd spent the night before at campsite 83, up Bone Valley, the deep one, and the girl said the strangest thing, laughing while she said it. She said they'd been kept up half the night by owls. I asked what the owls were doing. She said, talking to each other, one on each side of the creek, back and forth for hours. Her boyfriend hadn't heard it. He'd slept, and she'd lain awake listening to the 2 owls trade calls across the water. And she said the part that stayed with her was that they took turns so politely, never once called over each other. And sometime deep in the night the calls had moved, both of them together, down the valley, in the direction of Proctor, and faded out, and she'd finally slept. She told the whole thing as a nice story about nature, and I stood there with my saw ticking as it cooled, and let it be a nice story about nature, because what was I going to say? That owls don't hold conversations, that barred owls call in rolling bursts, and don't alternate in patient measured turns for hours. That what she'd listened to was a tally being run on her and the boy while they slept, 2 watchers trading counts across the creek, and that when the count was done and it came back harmless, the watchers had walked the length of Bone Valley in the black and come down to spend the small hours doing the same for me. I did tell them one thing. I told them the lower trail was rough, and the boat schedule was unreliable, and that if they wanted my advice, they'd push over the ridge to Eagle Creek that same day and be at the lake by evening. It was the only lie of my summer. The trail was in the best shape it had been in years. I'd seen to that myself, and I'd do it again. They thanked me and went. And they were fine, I know, because I checked the news for weeks after, and here's what I want you to take from the 2 of them. They spent one night, and got counted, and got escorted to the edge of the ledger, and walked out sunburned and happy with a nice story about owls. The valley had rules, and passing through clean was inside the rules. Staying was the violation. Staying, and working, and sleeping in the same spot night after night, raking their roads and hanging my food on their mountain. A man behaving with the confidence of somebody who believed the ground under him owed him something. Nobody had stayed since Carl Ramey. And once, on the last day of May, in the crack of a rock overhang 100 feet off the Bone Valley spur, wedged in where you'd cache something you meant to come back for, I found a toothbrush. A red plastic toothbrush, sun faded to pink, and the handle end was chewed, not puppy chewed. Worked, gnawed long and thoughtful, the way a man gnaws a pencil, the plastic gone soft-edged and white with tooth marks. Human mouth. Years of a human mouth. I put it back exactly the way it sat, and I have thought about that toothbrush more than about almost anything else in that valley. Somebody had carried it out of the world of drugstores a long time ago, and kept it, and used it until it was ruined, and cached it in dry rock. Whatever they were by now, they had started out as us. The cache under the overhang up the valley was worse. I found it on the 4th of June, following a flagging of orange survey tape I did not hang, tied at eye height on a dogwood limb, leading off trail. I knew better. I followed it anyway, because it was tied in a bow, a shoelace bow, and something about that domestic little bow got past my judgment entirely. 60 yards up the slope, under a granite lip, out of the rain, somebody had laid out a camp's worth of gear in a row. A green external frame pack, mice-eaten, a sleeping bag, rolled, a cook kit, a pair of boots, size 10 or so, standing together, laces tucked in. Boots. A man walks out of these mountains in his boots, or he doesn't walk out. In the pack's top pocket there was a spiral notebook swollen fat with old damp, and on the cover in ballpoint it said, C. Ramey, and the pages I could pry apart said the rest. Carl Ramey had my job. The dates in the book were from 2 seasons back. He was a retired school teacher from Silva doing volunteer trail work, and his early pages were bird lists and mileage, and how his knees held up, and then his pages were my pages. Tools moved in the night and set out where he'd find them. Rice gone. A hog snare of bright new wire tied off in knots he drew a picture of because he couldn't describe them, and his drawing matched the lashing I'd cut off the hickory to the turn. The clicking, which he called the tally, which is a better name than mine. His entries got shorter as June went on. The second to last one said he'd asked the boat to come early. The last entry was dated the 9th of June in the evening by his note of it, and it said, "Rain till 4, cleared the 2 poplars above the forks. The whistling tonight is closer and it has gotten better at." That's it. Midword almost. The pen line runs off the edge of the page. The notebook sat under that rock for 2 years with his boots standing next to it, and no search ever found it because as far as I have ever been able to learn, no search ever happened. And hold that thought too, because it comes back at the end. The whistling he meant started for me that same week, and Ramey was right. The horror of it was exactly that it got better. The first nights it was a fair copy of a Phoebe, except Phoebes don't call in the dark. Then it was a copy of me. I whistle while I file saw chain, an old habit, no tune, just aimless notes. On the 7th of June, from the laurel across the creek, in the full dark, my own aimless filing whistle came back at me, note for note, and then the pitch of it bent, and it came again wrong, on purpose. The notes stretched into a shape that no bird makes and no man would choose, a question mark of a sound. Sound is how they play with you before they close. I know that now. A copied voice in the dark is bait, and it is also practice, and it is also a way of saying, we have listened to you so closely that we can be you, and there is nothing about you we do not have. I was done. Money, pride, treaty, all of it. On the morning of the 8th of June, I got the radio from the cemetery hill and called dispatch and told them I needed the boat moved up, medical, if they had to code it that way. My judgment being that conditions in my section were unsafe for solo work. Dispatch took a long time coming back, and when it came back, it was Kathy herself, my supervisor, on the net at 8 in the morning, and she didn't ask one question. A supervisor always asks questions. Unsafe how? Injured how? Can you continue? Do you copy? Kathy asked nothing. She said Denny couldn't cross until Friday morning, the 10th, weather on the lake. And then there was a gap of air and she said, "Stay at Proctor by the water. Don't work your section tomorrow. Acknowledge." Acknowledge. I acknowledged. I walked down off that hill knowing 3 things. Friday was 2 days away. My supervisor had just told me, in the flattest voice I ever heard her use, to stay out of my own section. And whatever was in the file drawer at Sugarlands about Hazel Creek, it was thick enough that nobody needed my details to believe me. I want to tell you I stayed by the water. What happened was the trees came down. Thursday, the 9th of June, first light, there was a poplar across the trail between my camp and the lake. Green, full-leafed, alive the day before, laid straight across the corridor at chest height, a quarter-mile below Proctor, on the only stretch between me and the pickup bank. No storm in the night. No wind. I walked its root end, and the root ball was tipped up out of ground that had been chopped loose around it, grubbed and cut at the roots with something blunt, and the tree had been pushed. A green poplar that size goes better than a ton. It would take 5 or 6 strong people, and it would take them most of a night, and they had done it without one sound reaching me, and I had slept 200 yards away. A tree across a trail is nothing to a man on foot. You climb over it. I climbed over it. It's what it meant that mattered, and what it meant arrived in full about a minute later, when I came around the next bend and there were 2 more, crossed over each other, and the ground between them was staked. Sharpened hardwood stakes, burnt hard points, driven angled through the gaps a body would use, and brush woven through the whole tangle in that same over and under lashing until it wasn't blowdown at all. It was a fence. I have built fence and I have built fire line, and I know work meant to turn a walking thing when I see it, and it was mine. Built for my size, my reach, faced my direction. Passable, if I forced it, slowly, loudly, bleeding, with both hands busy for 10 minutes in a spot they had chosen. And behind me, up the valley, clear and easy in the morning air, the trail I'd spent a month clearing ran open and smooth toward Bone Valley. That direction, wide open, toward the lake, fenced, herded. The word arrived on its own. Every choice in front of me had been built by somebody else, and every easy step went up valley, away from the water, away from Friday, away from Denny and the gray boat, into the part of the drainage where Carl Ramey's boots stood facing the rock. So I did the one thing that 4 weeks of watching me could not have put in their plans, because I had never once done it in 4 weeks. I stepped off the trail on the creek side, and I went straight down Hazel Creek itself, into the water, and I ran. Not down the corridor, down the drainage. There's a difference, and my life rode on it. The trail swings wide of the creek in the lower mile where the gorge pinches. The creek goes through the pinch. Boulders the size of trucks. Laurel so thick over the water it goes dusk at noon. Ledges you lower yourself off blind into pools you hope are deep. No person herds another person through that, because no person goes through that. And that was the whole calculation. Their game was built on knowing me, and the me they knew was a trail man. And that man stopped existing the second my boots hit the water. They came anyway. I want to be plain about this part, because it's the part I'd give back if I could. When I broke pattern, the valley made its first honest sound in a month. From the slope above the fence, a whistle, loud, no bird song left in it, and it was answered down valley ahead of me, and answered again across the creek, 3 points, moving, and the clicking started up under the whistles fast and doubled. Talk, 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 talk. No spacing left. No patience left. And for the first time, I heard them move. Brush going over. Rock clatter on the far slope, matching my pace. Something crossing the creek behind me, one splash and no more. They were fast in the laurel, faster than I was in the water. And they were silent when they wanted to be, and they weren't wanting it anymore. The tally was over. What ran me down that gorge for the next 40 minutes was a hunt. And every one of those minutes, I understood with a clean, cold, roaring clarity that Carl Ramey's last sentence had no period, because you cannot punctuate the moment the whistling gets close enough. I went off the last ledge above the lake arm without checking the pool, dropped 9 or 10 feet in a crash of white water, came up swimming with the pack dragging me down and my shins opened up on rock, and I hauled out on the far side of the creek mouth onto the Drowntown flats where the timber thins, and the lake was in front of me, wide and gray and blessed and empty, and I turned around once. They stop at the open ground. That's what I saw, and it's the only clear sight of them I ever got, and it was enough. Back at the tree line above the flats, in the deep shade, 3 figures stood in the laurel edge, upright, man-shaped, man-sized, pale where the skin showed and not much showed, and utterly, absolutely still, the way herons are still. 60 yards of open flat between us, morning sun on it, and they would not cross it. And I stood dripping and bleeding in the light, knowing that the sun and the open ground were the entire remaining sum of my safety, and that they knew it too, and had known it for a month, and that everything that had happened in that valley had happened inside their rules, until the creek. One of them raised a hand. I raised mine to hikers on the trail, first 2 fingers off an imaginary hat brim, a habit from 30 years of right-of-way work. It raised its hand and gave me my own wave, exact, First 2 fingers, tip of the brim, and then the 3 of them were not there. I didn't see them go. The laurel didn't move. They were simply subtracted, and the woods stood there being ordinary, and I walked backward halfway across that flat before I could make myself turn around. Denny's boat came at 7 the next morning, a day early, no explanation, and I have wondered since whether Kathy sent him against the weather, or whether Denny just knew, because he ran the bow up on the mud and looked at my shins wrapped in duct tape and a spare shirt, and looked at me, and said nothing at all, and hauled me and 1 pack across the lake. My saws stayed at Proctor, cached in the horse barn, tagged with my name. For all I know, they're still there. I wasn't going back up for them, and here's the thing, nobody asked me to. A federal chainsaw is paperwork. Nobody ever asked. At Sugarlands on Monday, I sat across from Kathy with a resignation form that was already printed when I walked in, my name already typed on it. She slid it over. Personal reasons, the box already checked. I signed it, and she took it back and squared it on the desk, and for a second she stopped being a supervisor. She asked me if I was hurt. I said not really. She nodded, and she said the last thing anyone in that park ever said to me about it. She said, "The section's coming off the maintenance schedule. It'll go to natural condition. It should have gone years ago. Natural condition. That's the term of art for a trail the park stops maintaining and lets the mountain take back. No trail crew, no volunteers, no solo sawyers sleeping at Proctor." I looked it up the following spring, and sure enough, the park's trail bulletin listed Hazel Creek above the forks and all of Bone Valley as closed for resource protection, no projected reopening, and I sat with my coffee in a kitchen in Morganton and understood that I was reading a treaty, the real one, the one where the other side sets the terms, the way they'd been setting them all along, and some ranger above Kathy's pay grade signs it every year by leaving a drawer closed, and the drawer has Carl Ramey in it, and it has whoever was before him, and it very nearly had me, and the park side of the treaty is the same as mine was, minus the arrogance. Keep to your ground, mind your business, share the woods. I do line clearance work again, private contract, towns and highways, sodium lights and traffic noise, and I have learned to love every ugly decibel of it. I don't camp anymore. My hands still know the work and my legs still want the mountains, and I do not go. But I'll leave you where I told you I would, back at that cemetery on the hill above Proctor with the plastic flowers, because that's the detail that finished it for me. The park ferries the families across once a year, on Decoration Day, at the end of May, and that's the only day the graves get tended. Everybody agrees on that. It's in the park literature. I was in that valley from the 8th of May to the 10th of June, and Decoration Day came while I was there, and no ferry ran, because I'd have seen it, and Denny would have hauled it, and no soul came up that hill past my camp, because nothing came up that trail in daylight all month that I didn't read on the ground the next morning. And in the second week of June, on the oldest graves at the back, the ones with the stones worn down to bare shapes, the ones the visiting families walk past to get to their own people, the flowers were fresh, not plastic, cut, mountain laurel and flame azalea, tied in little bunches with strips of green bark, laid at the base of 11 stones with the tenderness you'd use on your grandmother's grave, and the bark strips were finished off in a lashing that went around and through itself in a pattern I could have tied myself by then, with my eyes shut. They come down at night and tend their dead. They've been doing it for 70 years, since the water took the towns and the government broke its promise about the road, and the families that ride the ferry once a year walk right past the proof and see decoration, and the park mows around it and sees nothing. And I stood among those graves on my last morning in the valley and finally understood the treaty in full. They stayed. When the lake came up and everybody signed and got on the trucks, some families walked up instead of out, into the laurel, into the ravines and the rock, out of the ledger, and their children were born up there, and their children's children run the tally on whatever sleeps at Proctor, and they bury their own in ground the government thinks it owns, one ridge over from graves the government admits to, and they lay flowers. That's who counted me every night for a month, not monsters, the neighbors, the oldest neighbors in those mountains, holding the oldest grudge, keeping the only appointments that still matter to them. And the reason I'm alive to type this is that I finally quit trespassing and got in the boat. The section's off the schedule now. Nobody maintains it. That's not true though, is it? Somebody